Good day. The last couple of hours in the battlefields in Ukraine have continued to remain, perhaps not quiet. Quiet, I suspect, is the wrong term. People are still fighting. Fighting is still going on. People are still dying. People are still being wounded. The horrors of war still continue. But at least for the moment, the situation overall appears to be stable. I say that, though there was, in fairness, a report which I saw in The Guardian this morning, and which presumably derives from Ukrainian official government sources, that Ukraine allegedly has captured certain more settlements in northern Kherson region. Now, this may or may not be true, but all I can say is I have found absolutely no report of the capture of these settlements on any of the Telegram channels, the many Telegram channels that I now follow. Perhaps I missed it somewhere. Perhaps these settlements were indeed captured by the Ukrainians. But as far as I can tell, the reality is that in Kherson region, as everywhere else, except Donetsk region itself, the situation on the battlefronts is stable. Now, in Donetsk region, there does seem to be continued significant progress by the Wagner group and the forces that support it in and around Bakhmut city. More suburbs, villages, if you like, but I would prefer to call them suburbs of Bakhmut, have gradually have been overrun, though Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is now openly presenting himself as the leader of the Wagner group, has said that sometimes in some of the claims people are making about these advances, they're actually running ahead of the events. And one particular settlement, which some Russian Telegram channels were claiming the Wagner group have captured, Prigozhin said that it still remains under Ukrainian control. But regardless of that, the overall direction of events is clear enough, and I've seen some maps which now show Bakhmut city, the vice, if you like, gradually closing in on Bakhmut city. The pincers now closing in on Bakhmut city. It's definitely now surrounded, from what I can see, on three sides. There's only the western side where there's still some means of access. I suspect that Russian artillery is able to shell the main road arteries, and it does increasingly look as if the position of the Ukrainian forces defending Bakhmut city is becoming extremely precarious, as if they're holding on by a thread. By the way, on that topic, there continue to be various claims and reports that the Ukrainians are planning some kind of pullout from Bakhmut city, that they're prepared to withdraw from Bakhmut city and retreat to Kramatorsk. Well, if you know my general feelings about this, about the unwisdom of holding on to undefendable places, then you know that that is absolutely my view about what the Ukrainians should do. It's what the Russians, by the way, have done consistently ever since Ukraine launched its offensive back at the end of August. They've never stood and fought. They've always prioritized the safety of their men. But I have to say, it's not been the pattern of Ukrainian actions up to this time. They've always held on for too long. They've always suffered excessive casualties, which could have been avoided if they'd retreated sooner. And of course, in the case of Mariupol, an entire military grouping was basically kept in Mariupol, eventually retreated into the Azovstal factory, and eventually had to surrender en masse to the Russians. So it's not what the Ukrainians have been doing up to now, and I'm far from confident that the Ukrainians will do what people perhaps want to believe they will do or expect them to do, which is retreat from Bakhmut city. There is a further reason why they might not do it, which is that, as I recall, President Zelensky, after the fall of Lysychansk, actually said that Lysychansk would be the last city to be captured by the Russians. And of course, if Bakhmut city is captured by the Russians, that will turn out to be wrong. And perhaps that will impel him to redouble his orders to the garrison in Bakhmut city, a very large garrison by most accounts, to hold on and fight to the bitter end. Anyway, we will see what happens. I would add that, as you will note, I am now simply referring to the Russians. I'm not talking about pro-Russian forces any longer, because it seems to me that since the 4 regions are now, according to Russian law, incorporated in the Russian Federation, we might as well refer to all of them, the militia as well, as the Russian forces, even though it's clear that the integrated command structure that is now being built up is still a work in progress. By the way, we've been hearing more about from General Surovikin, the new overall commander-in-chief. He's been visible, he's been making public statements. I'm not going to repeat what they are. They're the kind of things that you would expect a fighting general to say. He talks about launching strikes all over Ukraine, keeping up the tempo of operations all over Ukraine, of not seeing why Ukrainians should be given any rest, especially if this affects the lives and safety of Russian troops. It's the sort of thing you would expect a general to say, and he does seem to say it, and he says it well. Whilst I'm on the topic of General Surovikin, by the way, I got a rather interesting message from John Helmer, in which he pointed out to me that some affectionate and amusing and perhaps a little crude comments are circulating on the Russian side about General Surovikin. I'm not going to repeat what they are, but they do suggest to me an officer who is well regarded by the soldiers. I would just quickly add that. And I've also had people point out to me that the one specific allegation of arms trafficking that was brought against Surovikin and which led to a tribunal decision against him was overturned by an appeal court. Apparently he gave a pistol to a friend of his, and this person went ahead and sold it, and that was apparently the sum total of the arms trafficking charge, and it was established that Surovikin gave it in good faith and it was not intended to be any kind of trafficking. So I think, in fairness and completeness, I should say that. Anyway, I am, as I said, not familiar with General Surovikin. I don't know very much about him. I never heard of him until a few weeks ago. But so far, it seems to me that he's making all the right signals and the right moves. Now, from what I have been able to understand, the tempo of missile strikes by the Russian military across Ukraine remains at essentially the same level as we have seen. In other words, the missile strikes, the tempo of missile strikes has now been permanently increased. And it continues to be directed at military facilities, but also at the Ukrainian energy system. And the Ukrainian officials have now confirmed that the reason for the rise in the water level of the Dnieper River is precisely as I speculated yesterday, as on the basis of what other speculations were, it's not a plan to raise the surface level of the Dnieper. It is simply a response to the fact that large parts of the Ukrainian energy system have now been seriously, very seriously damaged, and Ukraine is having to compensate, is trying to compensate for this by using its hydropower facilities more intensively, and that means that more water is now passing through the dams, the dam near the Kiev reservoir. And it's been pointed out by a number of people that this isn't really a sustainable thing, that it's sooner or later going to run out of water. I'm going to make some further observation, and this is something I don't pretend to know very much about, but the cold weather is now soon upon us. At some point, I would presume that the surface water of the reservoir and of the Dnieper will start to freeze. I don't know whether you get complete freezing over of the Dnieper in this part of Ukraine, whether this is possible. But I wonder whether that will have any impact on the hydropower, on the use of the hydropower of the dams and things of that kind. Well, there are other reports, by the way, that the fact that Ukraine is increasingly suffering electricity and energy problems, that this is now making for Ukraine, giving Ukraine ever greater urgency to launch its planned offensive in Zaporozhye, to try to recapture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which accounts apparently for something like 20% of Ukraine's pre-war electric power output, that without the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, Ukraine, especially as these missile strikes continue, is going to find itself in very difficult situation. Some commentators on the Russian side have pointed out that the best period climatically for such an offensive to be launched has passed, that there is now frequent rain, the autumn rains are now upon us, that the ground is turning increasingly soft, that it might not be easy to carry out this offensive at this time, especially as Russian forces precisely in this area are especially strong. I'm going to say this, I've been hearing about this Zaporozhye offensive for weeks now. It's entirely a product in terms of commentary from the Russian blogging and military reporting community. The Ukrainians have said essentially nothing about it. Maybe it is being planned, maybe that is the intention. But I will wait and see. And if it does happen, I'm skeptical that it will be any more successful than any of Ukraine's other offensives up to this point have been. And on that last point, I would add that the Russians appear to have held on to all the ground that they recaptured near Liman in that counterattack which they launched the other day. And that does reinforce my feelings that even in that area where Ukraine has achieved its greatest successes in terms of the counteroffensives that it launched at the end of August and over the course of September and early October, that even in that area, their offensives are coming to a stop. One Russian website, or pro-Russian website, has actually now spoken about Russia regaining the initiative in the Ukraine war. That might be true. The military initiative, I mean. Well, we'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, a few further points. There's now been much discussion in the West about providing Ukraine with air defenses, and this seems to be now the major focus. HIMARS missiles apparently having run out or lost their effectiveness. I gather, I think I said this before, that apparently one military exercise in the Far East, Western military exercise in the Far East, had to be either cancelled or restructured because HIMARS launchers, which were supposed to participate in that exercise, couldn't do so because there were insufficient missiles to launch them from. There are now insufficient missiles left even for exercises of that kind, which is a fascinating thing. And we've been hearing that short-range anti-aircraft systems have now been supplied to Ukraine by Germany, and that there is a perhaps rather more sophisticated air defense system produced by Norway and the United States, which has also been supplied to Ukraine, which uses modified AMRAAM air-to-air long-range missiles, and apparently the UK is chipping in and is going to provide some of these missiles. I think the overall view in the West is it's going to be very difficult, all but impossible, in fact, to provide Ukraine with the kind of all-embracing air defense system that it needs. Ukraine started the war with what was on paper a sophisticated air defense system. It's become increasingly clear over the last few days that that air defense system has all but broken down, so that, you know, the steady Russian attrition over the last 7 months has clearly had an effect, and that air defense system isn't working. In fact, we're getting reports of Ukrainian surface-to-air missiles being launched, failing to hit their targets, and landing and destroying Ukrainian buildings. And some of these reports appear to be true. There was even a report of Ukraine using fighter jets to try to shoot down Russian kamikaze drones, which seems astonishing that they would use fighter jets for that, especially so given that the fighter jet in question, which is apparently a MiG-29, a modified MiG-29, was apparently in turn shot down, presumably by the Russians in some way. Anyway, I'm not going to get into the details of these things, and if I'm making any slips, well, please understand it's not always easy to get an accurate picture on these things. But the long and the short of it is that the West has never prioritized surface-to-air systems because it has always assumed that in any military conflict it would possess air superiority. Its air forces would be so powerful that there would be little real need for an air defense system of the sort that Ukraine needs now. So whilst the West could provide dribs and drabs of systems, systems like the short-range one that the Germans have now provided, which apparently isn't particularly effective, or so I'm told, and this somewhat more sophisticated but still limited US-Norwegian system, it is not possible to reproduce the air defense system that Ukraine started the war with back in February, or come anywhere close to doing so. So that apparently leaves the way open for the Russians to keep hammering away at Ukraine with their missile strikes all the way to the moment when the Russians start their ground offensive, and perhaps beyond. Anyway, that's where we are at the moment on the battlefields, to the extent that I am able to say. There are other things going on. And perhaps the most interesting thing was that Putin, who's proving incredibly busy, he's, by the way, flying today to Kazakhstan, where there's an important summit meeting of Central Asian and Middle Eastern states, and where he's due to have another meeting with President Erdogan of Turkey. Anyway, Putin gave a very interesting speech to an energy conference which has just taken place in Russia, and he repeated much of what he's already said about the way in which the energy crisis in the West is the product of Western policies, Western sanctions policies, but also Western climate change policies, green policies. But he also made some very interesting points about the oil price cap idea. First of all, one of the things he said was to quote the US economist, Nobel Prize winner, as he pointed out, Milton Friedman. And the quote he made was this one, which is about the oil price cap. If you want to create a shortage of tomatoes, for example, just pass a law that retailers cannot sell tomatoes for more than 2 cents per pound. Instantly, you will have a tomato shortage. It is the same with oil or gas. End of quote. And Putin went on to say, waspishly, that Friedman passed away in 2006. So what he said has nothing to do with the Russian government, and he cannot be designated a Russian agent of influence. And Putin then made the point that if the West is allowed to start imposing price caps on Russian oil, there is no reason why they shouldn't extend that practice to every other commodity, not just Russian commodities, but commodities of other countries, so that producers of commodities have an incentive to undermine this whole scheme. I've already discussed that. I've already explained why the Saudi decision, the OPEC Plus decision to proceed with an oil production cut, was partly, almost certainly, provoked by this oil price cap idea, Russian oil price cap idea. And Putin went on to say that it should be clearly understood that if the price of oil from Russia or other countries is limited, if some artificial price caps are imposed, this will inevitably worsen the investment climate in the entire global energy sector, thereby exacerbating the global shortage of energy resources and further increasing their cost. And this will primarily hit the poorest countries. And that's absolutely correct. And he goes on to say too, no amount of intervention or the unsealing of oil reserves will remedy the situation. And that seems to me correct. Also, he says that they simply do not have as much spare resources as they need. That is the whole point. And then he made some, he reminded everybody, I have to say one thing: Russia will not act contrary to common sense or underwrite someone else's prosperity. We are not going to supply energy to countries that introduce price caps. I want to tell those who prefer con jobs and shameless blackmail, that's Putin's words, I will want to tell those who prefer con jobs and shameless blackmail to business partnerships and market mechanisms. We have been living in this political paradigm for decades now. You should know that we will not do anything that disadvantages us. We strongly believe that stability, balanced energy markets and secure future for all nations can only be achieved through joint efforts in an open and honest dialogue based on the principles of joint responsibility and consideration for others' interests. And he then goes on to say that if Russian oil is capped, the Russians will not supply oil to those people who have imposed that cap. So that will provoke an even greater energy shortage. China, India, Turkey, all of these countries have apparently indicated that they will not abide by the oil price cap. And I believe that there's a report in Bloomberg, which I have not seen, which says that the United States has given up the idea of a set of secondary sanctions against these countries if they do import Russian oil above the oil price cap. Apparently, a US official has actually confirmed as much, and Bloomberg apparently also reports that this is now causing the United States to worry that the oil price cap idea, the Russian oil price cap idea, is hold under the waterline. And I am confident, by the way, that that is also the case. So that was what Putin was saying about the energy oil price cap idea. He also, by the way, and interestingly enough, floated the idea of Turkey now becoming the primary hub for gas exports to Europe. In other words, that the gas that used to be supplied via Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, which he said is repairable and which the Russians would be willing to repair if they were allowed to inspect and see what the damage done there was and worked out what needed to be done. He also pointed out that one particular line of Nord Stream 2 might not have been damaged. Well, anyway, that's what he said. But assuming that Nord Stream 1 and 2 can't be repaired, he said that the Russians are open to the idea of diverting gas flows in earmarked for Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 south to Turkey via Turk Stream. In fact, an extensively enlarged Turk Stream, and that would then make Turkey the major hub for supplies of natural gas to Europe. And clearly, obviously, this is a bait that he's dangling in front of Erdogan. We'll see whether Erdogan is attracted to it. Probably he will be when Erdogan and Putin meet in Astana in Kazakhstan. I would, by the way, add that there's still quite a lot of excitement in some places in the Western media about the fact that Turkish banks decided to pull back on their acceptance of the Russian Mir card. But in fact, as I understand it, there's now outline agreement between the Russians and the Turkish banking system to start an entirely new payment mechanism based on blockchain technology, which will be activated through the creation of a new bank and which will be in operation before the summer tourist season. So I think that this temporary blip with the Mir card is going to turn out to be only a temporary one. Anyway, I should say that Putin was on top form at this energy forum. He seems very confident of his position. He has all the facts at his fingertips. You don't have to agree with him. You don't have to accept his take on things. But the fact is, he did once again come across as being fully in command of his brief. Well, he is a lawyer, after all, by training, and perhaps that's not so surprising. And of course, he's now off to Astana, where he'll be meeting with Erdogan and with other, as I said, Central Asian and Middle Eastern leaders, including, I believe, the president of Egypt. And of course, he's already met with the UAE leader in Russia. So diplomacy continues actively. Now, all of this comes shortly after a UN General Assembly resolution critical of Russia over the referendums that it held in the 4 regions in, well, I'm going to still continue to say Ukraine, though I stress that from a Russian point of view, these regions are now part of Russia. But anyway, there was this General Assembly resolution, and it was a resolution that followed on from the Security Council debate 10 days ago, when the United States and its allies sought to present what was essentially the same resolution to the Security Council, only for the Russians predictably to veto it, and for India the China, Brazil, and I believe it from memory. Well, one of the African states, I think it was Gabon, they all abstained on that resolution. Well, according to this new mechanism that was created some months ago, in order to try to embarrass the Russians, there's a mechanism now in place whereby whenever a country exercises its veto in the Security Council, there is required to be a General Assembly debate in which basically the same resolution is put to the General Assembly and is put to a vote there, though unlike resolutions of the Security Council, a vote to the General Assembly is non-binding. So this is purely an exercise in trying to embarrass. That's all it is. Anyway, there duly was a vote in the General Assembly, and the thing that really struck me about it is that it again essentially reproduced the results of previous votes, the previous vote in the General Assembly that took place in March, when the Western powers proposed a resolution critical of Russia after Russia first sent its troops into Ukraine. Now, I will say, as I understand it, the number of countries that supported the resolution this time increased by 140, from 141 to 143. Brazil, which abstained in the vote on the resolution when it was at the Security Council, this time voted to support the resolution. I suspect this must have been under intense lobbying from the Western powers, probably very heavy lobbying of Bolsonaro, who has a difficult election coming at the end of this month, a presidential election coming at the end of this month. But overall, there doesn't seem to have been any significant shift in world opinion. And India and China and South Africa again abstained. And several other countries apparently absented themselves entirely from the debate. So that 35 countries either abstained or, as I said, didn't participate in a way that clearly signals their disapproval of this resolution. And somebody's added up the numbers, several people have added up the numbers, and have come to the conclusion that, in fact, the governments representing more than half of humanity did not support this resolution. Now, I think the Russians are intensely relaxed about all of this. The two countries that they really care about, China and India, abstained. I don't think they expected many countries to support them. I've discussed many times how difficult it is for countries around the world to support the annexation of part of one country by another country. But overall, from a Russian point of view, whatever damage was done was contained. And there's another factor which perhaps from a Russian point of view reinforces this. Now, in the run-up to the voting, the Russians proposed that the voting in the General Assembly be done by secret ballot. And the President of the General Assembly, who I believe comes from one of the Western aligned states, rejected that and insisted on an open ballot. Now, I have to say, I think this was a mischievous proposal on the part of the Russians. Secret balloting in General Assembly votes is possible and can happen, but I don't think it's very common, and I don't think it would be expected to happen on a vote of this nature. But the point is that the Russians proposing it probably would have known that if the ballot had indeed been secret, that it's highly likely that the number of abstentions would have been much greater. So They will just, as I said, emphasize the point. I say that because it is universally known and widely in fact, openly acknowledged by the United States itself that it keeps extremely careful tabs on how countries vote in General Assembly resolutions. And when I talked about lobbying, like, the US lobbying Brazil to get it to change its vote, I understand that this lobbying can be pretty intense. Now, the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, some months ago, gave examples of what he said US lobbying was like. Apparently, it extends to threats, according to Lavrov, that if a diplomat in the General Assembly votes the wrong way on a resolution, that any children of his who are studying in American universities might find that they're no longer able to do so. Things like that. Now, I don't know whether that is true. I have heard of such things, independent of what Lavrov said, but of course I have no direct knowledge of them. I think it's likely. And perhaps I've missed it, but I've not seen any denials. So you can imagine the kind of pressure countries come under if what Lavrov says is true, and why, in the event of a vote in the General Assembly on an open ballot, many countries which inwardly might have doubts about a resolution might nonetheless be unwilling to cross the United States. Anyway, it's a little bit speculative because, as I said, I don't know what American diplomats say to the diplomats and representatives of other countries in advance of General Assembly votes. But there we go. One way or the other, though, I think, as I said, that the Russians will not be fazed by this vote in the General Assembly. They're much more interested by the fact that OPEC Plus cut oil production, infuriating the United States. And of course, Putin, far from being isolated, is on his way now to Astana, where he's going to meet all sorts of important people, including President Erdogan of Turkey. Now, I'm going to finish this video with two further points. First, I discussed yesterday Josep Borrell, the EU High Representative on Foreign Affairs, and I said how crass his comments about energy seem to me to be, and about his inability to acknowledge the extent to which Europe has authored its own problems. And equally crass comments have been made by NATO's Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg. He said that a victory for Russia in Ukraine would be a defeat of NATO, and that's why it must be prevented. Now, I can't help but think that this must have been deeply unpopular in some NATO capitals, including probably in Washington, because, of course, what that means is that if Russia does win a victory in Ukraine, which seems to me all but certain, then Stoltenberg has already told us in advance that that victory, that Russian victory, when it comes, will be a defeat for NATO. Now, that seems to me a reckless and irresponsible thing to say. It's one which I'm sure the Russians will remind everybody of when that Russian victory happens. And of course, the admission that NATO has suffered a defeat is certain to unnerve some of the East European states, particularly countries perhaps like Bulgaria, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, who knows, and conceivably might even cause them to have doubts about the overall NATO guarantee. And of course, I haven't even touched on countries like the Baltic states and Poland in that context. So again, a stupid comment, in my opinion, by Stoltenberg, and one which he might come to regret at leisure. And the second point I want to make, which is a brief one, it's a technical one, is about these kamikaze drones, these geranium kamikaze drones that we're hearing so much about. Now, I know nothing about these technologies. I've never set myself up as any sort of expert. Most commentators assume that these are Iranian drones that Russia has imported. It's important to say that Iran continues to deny that it has supplied any drones or drone technology to Russia. And I understand that Andrei Martyanov and others are now saying that this attribution of these drones to Iran is wrong, that these are Russian designed and Russian built drones, that they're built by the Zala Corporation, which is, I understand, a branch of the Kalashnikov concern, and that the similarity with certain Iranian drones, with the type of Iranian drone, is pure, well, not coincidence. It's just that kamikaze drones of this nature all tend to resemble each other. And there are other examples, apparently, around the world of this. Now, I don't know whether that is true or not. As I've said previously, I have no way of knowing one way or the other. I'm not an expert in these things, but I do think it's worthwhile to mention it. I'm going to simply refer to them as kamikaze drones from now on, not bother to mention whether they're Iranian or not. It could be that the story that they are Iranian is simply mischief-making by some people in the West. I've no idea one way or the other. Certainly, I've no doubt that the Russians would be perfectly capable of designing and making drones like this independently of Iran, and for all I know, that's what's happened in this case. Anyway, at that point, I'm going to leave this program. I hope it's been of some interest, and in the meantime, remind you once more that you can find us on our various other platforms: Locals, Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, and of course we're also now on Rofkin. And just to remind you again that I do live streams exclusively on Locals every Wednesday at 1400 hours Eastern Standard Time. It was a very interesting and successful live stream yesterday, and you're very welcome to join us on Locals and to participate in that live stream every Wednesday, when you can put whatever question you want to put to me. And if you want to support our work, remember you can do so via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And you can also go to our shop, buy the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. No doubt much more happening before long. We'll see whether the Ukrainians do get round to launching this offensive in Zaporozhye, if it's even planned. We'll see what General Surovikin does. We'll see what the economic situation turns out to be. We'll see what the political situation in the United States and elsewhere turns out to be. One way or the other, on the Duran and here on this channel, we will cover it, I will cover it, and have a very good day until we reconvene again.